Can you tell me something about your research on the park?
I was working with LivingMaps, and we basically went and looked at residents' experiences of East Village, which is the former athletes' village. So it's the first residential development since the Olympics. And the first residents actually moved in towards the end of 2013, and we started the research around about September 2014. So although it was a year later, there was still very, very few residents had moved in when we actually started it. So it was an investigation into a pioneer community, and the research went on for about a year, 2 months. So over that period of time, we saw a lot of changes very quickly in the build-up of people. So by the end of the research, East Village was virtually full of people by then. And also we saw the development of the retail units underneath the flats. So it was really a study of a place coming into being made. How is it going to be constructed by the actual residents themselves? What did they think about the place?
Okay, this was a mixed tenure scheme. Can you tell me something about the different demographics between the tenures?
Yes. So, obviously, I was doing a qualitative study, so I wasn't counting the numbers of people in the different, tenures, and they didn't give us access actually to the exact statistics. So it's more about the narratives that were coming from the people, and obviously the people that I met, than a kind of fact-finding mission. But there was definitely, I'd say, more families in the social rented housing. And I think originally GLL, which is the private rented, they have got family homes, and they thought that they were going to have families moving in there. But actually what they got much more was students sharing. So in these sort of 4-bedroom flats that they were originally thinking they'd get families, they were actually getting student shares, and a lot of young people sharing, because that made it affordable for them, basically, because it was quite expensive, the private rented. So then obviously, if you're dividing that by 3 or 4 people, it becomes affordable. So you were getting far more young people, quite a lot of young professionals in the private rented. And then in the social rented housing, you were getting much more of a diversity. You were getting much more of an ethnic diversity, and more of a diversity in terms of occupations that people were doing and their kind of situations in life, much more families. And as for the other 2 tenures, I think it's hard to say. My feeling was that for the intermediate renters, you were getting a bit of both. You were getting some young professionals, some professional people, and some families as well, because it was it was a little bit cheaper. And for the shared ownership, again, it's quite hard to say, really. I think you were getting slightly maybe older people in those, because they were buying, as opposed to obviously the renters that were hadn't got to that stage of buying properties yet.
One of the things that you might be able to comment on, and you might not, is that one of the Newham wants to build a more sustainable community. Did you find there was a high turnover in Get Living London compared to, for example, the social housing?
I mean, again, it wasn't something I was directly studying, so and we were there for a year and a bit, so I think it's really hard to say. I certainly talked to some of the GLL tenants who had come at a later stage, or talked about not staying for that long and they were going to move on. But equally, there were some of the intermediate renters who also talked about that they'd probably be moving on. Some people had children, and they thought this wasn't necessarily the place they ultimately wanted to bring their children up. Whereas clearly the social tenants, most of the ones I spoke to, actually had secure tenures. So they would have had much more of a sort of long-term view, and equally the shared owners had more of a long-term view. So I would say, yes, inevitably there was more movement. But I think people did appreciate the fact that they could have extended rented tenancies over a period.
I just wanted to talk about disability, actually, in terms
Right.
of the demographic. And obviously the village was designed with Paralympic athletes in mind. So was it accessible?
Right, okay, that's quite interesting, because I did interview quite a few people with disabilities and some wheelchair users, And on the plus side, the park itself is just fantastically accessible if you're in a wheelchair. I mean, they all talked about how it's literally, you could leave the house in your wheelchair without having to worry about drop pavements. In other words, just the same as most people, you don't have to plan ahead and find out if there's steps and stuff like that. So it was really amazing. It gave people a real sense of freedom, and also a sort of, they talked about having a sense of security in the public space. The flats, much more of a mixed view, because whilst there was some adaptations if you're a wheelchair user, there were quite a few problems as well. Like the cupboards, for example, were all high. So if you're in a wheelchair, you couldn't necessarily access your cupboards. Quite a few people had problems with opening the doors with the wheelchair, and they had problems getting that fixed. The actual housing providers wouldn't fix that for them, so they had to, one person got in a charity to help sort of make her door more accessible, and the other person had a problem getting into their one of the downstairs communal rooms, and Triathlon, who was her housing provider, wouldn't. They said they didn't have the money to fix that for her, and what that meant was she could leave the flats really easily. The door went that way, but when she came back, she literally couldn't reach to open the door, and there was no automated opening. So she just used to have to wait till someone else in the building came, or she had to phone someone. And I know that even when I was there, and I was there for, a year, I had tried to help her get onto that, and she tried on her own, and everyone tried to help her get that sorted, and there was just no way she could get it sorted. They wouldn't pay for it, and because it was communal space, they wouldn't allow a charity to come in and do it. So I think that still hasn't been fixed, actually.
In terms of thinking about residents' perception of place, this was an interesting project. It was the conversion of the athletes' village, very high profile. Mm-hmm. How did that feed into residents' perception of place, living on what was the Olympic athletes' village? Okay,
so, there were some people that really weren't bothered. They just literally wanted a secure home in a nice place, and that was what they were focused on. Other people were more... some people were actually attracted to the area because of that. So I would say on the whole, again, social rented, people who are doing social renting, because there's such pressure on social rented property, and there's very little around. A lot of those people had come from really terrible situations, really overcrowded, being homeless, flats that weren't at all adapted if you had disabilities, and they really just wanted somewhere that was a nice place to live and secure, and it wasn't they didn't really care about that element of it. But I think for the people that had more chosen to come there, so like the private renters, maybe the shared ownership people, for them that seemed to be more of a reason that they might have come in the first place, or that once they got there they quite liked the fact that this is where the athletes were. So it certainly was something that was appreciated, but was not necessarily the primary concern, particularly of the people who were struggling beforehand to find anywhere decent to live at all.
Thank you. Thinking about the village and the design of it, because the design, high density, offset by very nice public realm. Yeah. How did that feed in? Did people like that? Was that an attractive part? How did people respond to that? Okay, so there's two parts to that, isn't there? There's the high density and then the public space. So in terms of the green space, which, part of the project was actually taking photographs, and it's very evident in the pictures that, you've got this amazing green space. And I did some ethnographic pictures where I asked people, I'm going to do a portrait of you, tell me where you want me to do this picture, somewhere, that's important to you in the local area. And a lot of people chose the green space. I mean, it was very much valued. Again, it wasn't necessarily why people had moved there, but people really valued it. And they tended to use the park quite a lot. They used it for walking, for cycling, for taking their kids out. A lot of people talked about it kind of being not like London, which is quite funny, because the reason that the Olympics was put there in the first place is because, East London was so kind of metropolitan and crowded and busy. And this is definitely a kind of place that it feels very separate and different to the rest of East London, and a lot of people commented on that. Could you say something more about that?
Yes, I mean, I think, again, thinking about the photographs, especially at the beginning, but really right through the series of images, what you see is, you see this empty space. And on the one hand, you can be thinking, actually, that's amazing. It's done exactly what the legacy said. It's produced this beautiful public space with lots of space and room to walk around. You can see the sky. But I think, and I hope the questions raise the question of, but where are all the people in East London? Because when you think about the original East Londoners, all the host boroughs that the Olympics was set up to improve, I think the photographs raise the question of, well, where are they? Are they using this space, or are they over the bridge in E15? Are they still in overcrowded? Are they still jostling on the streets? And of course, if you go over the bridge, that is how it is. So I think for me, the exciting follow-up project would be to go over that bridge and go to E15, the other side in Newham, and look at what their experience of the legacy is. Because clearly this has been developed. A lot of people have come in from outside of East London. Not to say there aren't, and there are some East Londoners there, and there are some people from East London who desperately needed social housing, like I said. But there are a lot of incomers as well. I'm not saying incomers shouldn't be able to come in, but we have to remember that the legacy originally promised to help those East Londoners that already lived there. So it was certainly perceived by the residents themselves as a kind of a bit of a bubble, and a lot of them didn't. I mean, some of them went over to Stratford or Hackney Wick, but some of them actually didn't ever go there. They were more likely to use East Village and then use the transport infrastructure to get them to the West End or other kind of exciting places.
Thinking about space again and place, just thinking about the housing, what were people's perceptions of the housing? You've said something, but maybe a bit more. Very nice design, the winter gardens and...
Yeah, I did only meet one person who had a winter garden, actually, and that was GLL. So, yeah, I mean, obviously people on the whole, they saw the flats before they went there, and they were either choosing to move in or sort of agreeing to move in if that was what they'd been offered. So, to be fair, most people were very positive about the flats. I mean, I wouldn't say there was a huge amount of storage, but most people had, managed their stuff in there, and they all had big windows. So there was a lot of light. So I think people, they seem to be really enjoying their flats. And although I know there are some differences, like there are some penthouse flats, and then some of the private rented flats look out over the wetlands, and I know they've got a kind of premium cost on them. Actually, generally speaking, you couldn't tell that much. When you first walked in, you couldn't tell what tenure it was. I mean, people told me, they said, oh, well, we didn't get wooden floors, or we didn't get this, or we didn't get that, So there clearly were some differences. But actually, overall, there was definitely a sort of sense of equity across the tenures. And I think that was, people kind of appreciated that as well.
So there's equity across the tenures, but they are physically separated, is that right? But share gardens. Could you say something about that?
I was talking to residents, and it was more about their perceptions than this kind of fact-finding mission. But from what I could understand, there was some of the blocks were private rented, were GLL owned basically, and the other blocks were triathlon managed. So you could be in a triathlon block, and you would then have a mix. You could have a mix of the three different tenures that triathlon had: the shared ownership, the intermediate rented, and the social rented. So there could be some mix. But it was weird because then there was another triathlon block that seemed to be just only shared ownership people. So I don't quite know how they decided that. And then obviously if you were in a GLL block, it was purely market rent, because that's all they had. And I think when I kind of challenged this, or kind of asked, well, why aren't they more mixed up, more pepper potted? I think it was to do with, what they were saying was that GLL, to look after the building, and it would be too complicated if it was shared, if one building was shared by the two different housing providers. But there was some mix. It wasn't like there wasn't any mix at all. Definitely in the triathlon ones there was a little bit of mix.
Just following on with that, with the community infrastructure, because there was a lot of attempts to build a community.
Yes.
What sorts of things happened, and how successful? What was successful? What wasn't successful?
I mean, I do think again, you know, as an interviewer, you're more likely to talk to the residents that are out and about, you know, engaging in the community than those who kind of stay in their rooms and don't open the door. So there's a slight skew there, although I did try and access, you know, the ones that weren't the prime sort of suspects in that way. But I would say there was quite a positive feel amongst the residents of feeling like they were part of this new community. And for some people there was a lot of Facebook sites. There was a lot of Facebook sites, and for some people it was simply a matter of going on Facebook, exchanging messages, like finding out where the best place to buy this is, or the best place to get your hair cut, or whatever, locally, like exchanging information. And for some people it was just the sensation that that was going on in there, and they didn't have to go out and meet people, and they were happy with that. And for other people, they were active. You know, they set up their own meetup groups, they set up their own websites and their own kind of art creative hubs, and they set up there was a residents association, there was a knit and natter group where they used to come and meet. So residents themselves set stuff up. 2 residents got involved with setting up, with a parent and toddler group that was set up. So there was quite a bit of kind of volunteering going on. So there was quite a lot of activity going on, but I mean, clearly it didn't include everyone, but then not everybody wants to be part. I mean, some people said to me, well, actually, I don't go out, I don't mix with people, but that's fine, I'm happy with that. So.
And you were there for 14 months. Did you think it was quite a successful early community?
Yes, I mean, they put a lot of resources into that community. You know, as you probably know, they had enhanced policing, so they had far more police on the streets cycling around than in other places. They had a community engagement team. They had an East Village management team, so they had people walking around at all times. So it was kind of patrolled, and people felt like there was always someone they could go to if there were any issues. It was well lit. It was had lots of CCTV. Some people complained about that, but on the whole, people felt it was secure and safe. It was, you know, it was controlled and monitored to some extent. So if there was antisocial behaviour, there was, you know, it's always something. It's not something that can be easily controlled, but there were people to call on. So I think the people that lived there on the whole felt like, I think they felt like they were living in quite a well-managed place. And like I say, it was highly resourced, so I guess that's not too unsurprising.
So you had triathlon homes and GLL homes, effectively. Yeah. So was there any confusion for residents if something breaks in their apartment? Was there a confusion about where they might go?
No, they knew who their landlord was.
Okay.
You know, there might have been a slight difference in response depending who your landlord was, but no, they weren't confused.
What did you think people liked about living at the village?
Well, probably just stuff that we've touched on, really. I think people, they definitely like the open spaces, they like the flats. Some people had complaints about the flats, and some people had complaints about the design of the flats went around a central courtyard, so there was this communal courtyard and there was lots of noise, and people did complain about that a bit. But generally, like I say, they like the green spaces, they like their flats. Most people seem to quite enjoy being part of this pioneer community. And the trouble was, I did hear of people that didn't like it and were leaving, and I couldn't interview them. And I don't know if it's that kind of thing. Once people have gone, right, I'm out of here, they don't have an interest in talking to you. So I know some people did leave quite soon. So of course I'm talking to the ones who remained.
I just wanted to roll forward 5 years. What do you think will be happening at East Village?
There's more neighbourhoods coming there. In total there's 5 new neighbourhoods coming, and they've already got Chobham Manor, which is right next door. They've also got a hotel going up. So at the moment, whilst the demography has a certain kind of, I wouldn't say it's exactly balanced, but there is a cross section between people of different socio-economic groups and different ethnicities and different abilities. This balance will change. You know, certainly with Chobham Manor, which is right next door, you know, but as time, and then with the hotel, that'll be more tourists coming in. So I think that kind of sense of people were the first people here, you know, we're going to make links with our neighbours or people in other blocks, and we're not bothered what tenure they're from or what their background is, we're all kind of in this together. I think that will change because the proportion of people from higher income backgrounds, it will go up, because in the new developments the proportion allocated for social rented has gone down. So that clearly will change the balance. But I don't know, I think it would be very interesting to, obviously, you know, it's scheduled to, the development's scheduled to go through till 2020. I mean, the legacy by no means is done and dusted. So I think, you know, it's really important to keep your eye on this and see what happens.
Thank you. Wanted to now ask you something about the images. You've been taking some photographs. Whether you could show us some images and tell us something about those images.
Okay, so so basically the project was an ethnography, and it was a lot of observation and in-depth interviews, but also there were two different kinds of photography. There was ethnographic photography, which was me taking images of the place over the time and of the residents as time went on and I got to know them. And then there was another part, which is I worked with the residents, a group of residents, cross-section of residents, who took their own pictures of the place. So I worked with them doing workshops over several weeks, and kind of gave them themes like home, the environment, personal geographies, and they'd take the pictures on these themes to kind of, so they could have their own kind of collaborative, you know, story and set of images about the place. I worked with the residents, the resident photographers, collaboratively to put on an exhibition at the Sir Ludwig Gutman Health and Wellbeing Centre. So we worked on that even after the workshops were finished. We carried on working on that for several months together to put this exhibition on, which is all kind of part of the research actually, as I became more involved and more engaged. So partly the images took me into that community, I think, in a much more personal and intimate way. Also because it was changing so rapidly, I could almost, what happened when I finished the research, I looked at these images and I analysed them. These are the ones I took. And I saw a lot of things, almost when you're there, you've got so much going on, you don't have time to really take it all in, even if you're writing notes. But you've got this, you've got a layer of visual text, if you like, that tells you some things you hadn't thought about. So you sit analysing the images and notice and think about things that you might not have done at the time. And partly for me that was about some things I've mentioned, like the amount of space and absence of other people on the streets, which was particularly, I was particularly taking those pictures at the beginning when I didn't really know the residents, but also quite a lot about the signage. I started thinking about how the images and their images and my images were giving a new representation, because this place, this Olympic space, had been so kind of over-imaged. You know, even before it was built, you know, there's this kind of imaging, future imaging of it in order to get the bid. And then there was all these new images, the housing providers were producing these images, LLDC were producing all these images, and, you know, of course they were going to be celebratory. But these were much more, you know, between us, I think we produced a much more sort of complex and, more considered representation of the place. So it kind of contested that, if you like, that kind of dominant representation of the place. So I think that was really important. So these were the first lot of images coming through really that weren't kind of controlled by the people in whose interest it was to kind of, you know, make a celebration of it. And I'm not saying there weren't positive things about the place, but it was much more complicated than that. There was, you know, not everyone had a positive experience there. One person, for example, I know, actually got ill health. She was in intermediate rented accommodation, and she got very ill, and because she was the intermediate rented sector, it was actually in the tenancy agreement that she wasn't allowed to claim housing benefit, and in fact ultimately she was evicted. And if you look at the portrait of her, you can see she's not as happy as some of the other people. You can see it in her face. She looks anxious, and you can see her stuff in the background. It isn't kind of on the walls looking like this is home. It's kind of still wrapped up, and she's ready to go. This is your village police. And this is Sainsbury's there in front of. They've got these kind of athletes. But I thought this kind of draws attention to the fact of, who's making the images of this place, and what is it they want to say about this place. I mean, you've got these very kind of, not saying, of course, there were Paralympic athletes there, and that was marvellous, but it I think makes the police look kind of like on their bikes. Are they an image? Are they a spectacle? Are they a service? And again, you've got the real people, and then you've got the kind of, is this the kind of people they're trying to get in there? So what I noticed, particularly at the beginning, when I didn't know the residents, so I wasn't going in people's homes, and I was kind of walking the territory and photographing what I saw, and then thinking about it later, and largely what I saw on the streets, because there weren't many residents, was business people and workers. There's another one, actually. This was in the health centre, and this was quite early on. And again, you've got, it's a little bit busier now, but not that much busier. You've got one patient, and then you've got this kind of crowd of, I don't know who they are. They're NHS managers, business people, but you definitely got a sense there were a lot of people walking around in suits, and it was really obvious right at the beginning. And I think it definitely raised the question of, who is this legacy for? And when you're doing a study on residents' perceptions, clearly you're focusing a lot on the residents, whether they're benefiting, whether they're not. But I think what the pictures did is draw attention to the fact of the other people who are benefiting. So corporate interests benefiting, business people benefiting, who was working there, workers benefiting, but where were the workers from? Were the workers from East London, the place that the legacy was supposed to be benefiting? Were they from elsewhere? Clearly there's lots of different ways of community being made, but what you're talking about is not something that's kind of evolved. You're talking about, can something be kind of constructed in a short period of time? Thinking about this being a new place, which is very different to sort of trying to construct a community once a place exists. They did, as I've said, they put a lot of resources into the place. So they do put on, GLL and Triathlon both put on public events. So they have firework displays, they have fairs, they have athletic things, they have kids things happening in, a lot of it's happening in that green space, Victory Park, which is immediately outside of the flats. And I think, it does something. It means on those days people are kind of out there interacting, but it is just days. And I think what the place at the present really lacks is an actual community centre. So they haven't yet designated. They have designated a space for community rooms, but they have not yet made agreements about it. So it's been like 2 years, more than 2 years, and they still have not got a community space. And I think that's lots of people commented on that, and people with kids. I mean, some people have set up parent and toddler groups. So some of this stuff is coming from the officials. They're putting resources and money into setting some of this stuff up. But even with the parents and toddlers, there was a problem with where they were going to be located. So at one point they were located in this cafe, and this cafe was brilliant. It was run by volunteers. It was actually run by the church. And because it was run by volunteers, it was cheap. Because it was cheap, you really did get a lot of people going there, and that was a brilliant community space. But in the end, the volunteers ran out, and this was the space that, actually this isn't what it was supposed to be used for. So anyway, that didn't last. And the problem with the other spaces, there are now cafes and bars, and they're all quite expensive. So if you haven't got much money, you might go there as a special treat, but that's probably all you can do. Whereas clearly if you've got money, you can go there more often, and it probably does become more of a community space. I mean, there was certainly community stuff going on. They had karaoke at the neighbourhood pub, and the vicar, the minister for the Olympic Park, she actually lives in East Village, and she wanted to create community, and she put a lot of efforts into it, and she went to the karaoke. I've got a photo, one of my residents took a photo of a group of them doing karaoke. So, certain people did engage in these events, and they definitely helped construct a community. But I don't know, community probably happens over time, doesn't it? And it happens through people staying in a place. So maybe for the people in the social rented accommodation who are there for a long time, and maybe for the people in the shared ownership who are committed to being there, and a few of the private renters were definitely committed to staying there, over quite a long period of time. So I think for some people there will be something that's lasting there, that they'll create between, amongst themselves. Because like I say, a lot of it was also coming from them. They were putting their own meetups on Facebook, and Knit and Natter came from them. But again, I think we have to wait and see what happens, because in 5 years, will those GLL renters, who some of the private renters were really engaged in sort of constructing community, but will they still be there? Will they have bought into Chobham Manor? Will they have had kids and moved somewhere completely different or out of London? I mean, the shared ownership people might move on as well. Social renters probably less likely to, because it's so difficult finding a decent place. So yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to find out, is the test of community something really you have to test over time, I think.